there. Welcome to A to Zig. Today we're going to be talking about environmental activism. I have with me a good friend and somebody who's been an environmental activist probably since he was at his mother's feet. His mother was an activist also. Peter Sinclair. Peter is going to talk about his experiences in the world of environmental activism. And this program is really to give you a sense of where we are in the world. We hear a lot of things. And so I'd like to start by thanking Pete for joining me today. And Pete's going to share some of his experiences as I ask him some questions. So first question is, what is the condition environmentally of the Great Lakes as you see it?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not an expert, but I talk to a lot of experts.
Yeah, and I know you do.
Yeah, I do a monthly video for the Yale University School of Environment, and so I've talked to literally hundreds, probably more than 1,000 scientists and engineers over the last few years. And this is a big topic here in our area. The Great Lakes are threatened. They would be threatened even in the absence of climate change, but climate change is an X factor that kind of elevates so many things. For instance, one of the great impacts of climate change that we see here in the upper Midwest is increased rainfall. And I think anybody, certainly anybody our age, knows that you're getting these hard precipitation events that we did not used to see with the frequency when we were younger. And it's impacted us here in Midland. I mean, we've had a couple of dam failures. Those were dams that were old, they were poorly maintained, but the weakest link is what's going to break first. And after a series of an increasing frequency of large precipitation events, they finally failed. And that's a perfect example of how climate change kind of creeps up on you. Is you start finding out that the infrastructure that was adequate 50 years ago suddenly is no longer. And I'll give you some examples. According to the weather station here at Tri-City Airport, the frequency of these extreme precipitation events has increased almost 50% in the last 30 years.
Wow.
In Ludington, on the shore of Lake Michigan, I looked this up last night and it just about knocked me out of my chair. It has increased 130% over the last 30 years. And that's significant because these big precipitation events are what they wash everything that's not tied down either into a storm sewer or directly out into the lake. Yeah. And so nutrients from farmers' fields, dog poop, chemical spills, septic fields, whatever it might be, gets overwhelmed with this extra rain and it ends up in the lake. So we're worried about extra nutrients going into the lake and pollutants. And then because the lakes are warmer, we are starting to see organisms in them that we did not see 50 years ago because it simply was too cold for certain types of organisms to overwinter. And we've got a great expert, Alan Steinman at Grand Valley State University, who's made a life's work of looking into this, and he's one of the people I've talked to. But we're starting to see these algae blooms in places where we did not see them before. We've seen them in Lake Erie. Mm-hmm. In fact, in 2014, the Toledo water supply had to shut down for several days in August because of a toxic algae bloom, and it was like it looked like a scene out of the developing world. People had to line up to get fresh water because they couldn't trust the water supply of that Great Lake, which ought to be a warning klaxon for us. And now, in the past year, we have started to see these blooms even in Lake Superior.
Well, you know, you bring that up and I think it's important for people to visualize that when they go out in the warm weather and look around, because there is maps that show that the algae blooms are now spreading even into Lake Superior. And that's an indication, and that's a very cold lake. So it is an indication that climate change is coming. But you're right about the waterfall that is coming from the sky. And that's the way I see it, because I know many times I've driven down to Detroit or other places, and the drain systems down there on the expressways can't handle it. I mean, it's just all of a sudden there's 3 feet of water, 4 feet of water, and people have to slow down. And those highways were designed to take away water, but not this much water.
Exactly, exactly. The engineers who were working in the 50s, 60s, 70s when these were built were looking at a set of assumptions that was valid at that time. But we're literally living on a different planet now. And the old assumptions no longer work. I mean, I saw it on my house. I had to change the rain gutters around my house to kind of an industrial scale because I couldn't keep the water from just pouring out of the gutters and gathering around my house. And it cost me thousands of dollars to do that.
Yeah.
So these expenses are adding up, and it amounts to an ongoing tax that the climate change is extracting from all of us, little by little.
Well, can you maybe talk a little bit about the consideration we have to make as environmental activists? And maybe you would be able to talk to the audience about your experience as an activist and what you see is taking place globally in this whole area.
Well, I think you ask around, most people care about things like clean water and clean air. The deficiency is not so much that people don't care, but that we're under assault from misinformation. That's probably our biggest problem in so many areas right now. And that's why I've always made it a practice to go directly to people whose expertise I can trust, which for me usually means somebody with a PhD and 20 or 30 years working, studying, publishing in a field.
Well, time out. So if you go on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and somebody proposes that climate change is not real, you're going to just ignore it?
I have some bad news for you, Ziggy. Not everything you see on Facebook is correct.
Oh, God. It's such a disappointment. I thought that was the answer to all questions.
Yes, you can do your own research on Facebook. Have you heard that phrase?
Yeah, I heard that, yeah. And I laugh because as an academic who actually has students at university level doing research, I constantly remind them to find scholarly sources. And scholarly sources are not what you find Googling, you have to actually get into journals and get peer-reviewed articles and things that other scientists have looked at to determine whether it has credibility.
Yes, there are people who have actually spent their lives doing research.
Yeah.
We call them researchers.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you talk to them, it saves you a whole lot of time as opposed to going to Cousin Fuzzy's Facebook page.
Yes, and I hope that people understand that the experts are not in some kind of worldwide conspiracy to deceive us about climate change, because it's so obvious that the climate is changing.
Right. Right, and this is the other thing, is the conspiratorial bent that I run into all the time. And I don't argue with people about climate change anymore.
Yeah.
That 10, 15 years ago, that was where I spent a whole lot of my time. The people that we're down to that 15 or 20% who are just never going to get it. Mm-hmm. They're dug in. They're never going to get it. We now have, and I work with people, my colleagues at Yale are some of the best pollsters on this issue. The largest group in the population now is about a third people who are actually alarmed about climate change.
Okay.
And then there's another 20% or so that are concerned. They're quite concerned. And then you have more that are like cautious, like they kind of know something's going on, but they need more information. So that's my mission, is to kind of go to the researchers. I take myself out of the picture. I ask them the question, and all I do is just sort of coach them on how to keep it in plain English. And so and then I try to just keep pushing this stuff out onto social media so that the people can have contact with the actual researchers.
Well, what can the person who is home or in the neighborhood or community do as an activist then to kind of raise the conscious level of people around them?
Well, I think we talked about information, and I think that's absolutely critical. You know, seek out good sources of information, as I said, from reliable sources, and then communicate with other people. This is the other thing about climate change that we don't do, is we don't talk about it. You know, so talk about it at work, at church, at your garden club, in the locker room, at the center. You know, at the water cooler. Our neighbors often don't know that we're concerned about climate change too. Odds are people that you know are concerned about climate change. They see things that are going on and they're worried about it, but we've been sort of accustomed to not bringing it up in
Well, I think
conversation.
one of the transitions that is difficult for people to make is that they have to look at their lifestyle and realize they have to make some changes.
Well, yeah, and you know, I've got a light over my desk that you know, works great. I can see what I'm doing, and you know, it's an LED bulb that I wouldn't have been able to buy 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And it uses a tiny fraction of the electricity that I would have used with a bulb, an older bulb. Hasn't changed my lifestyle all that much.
Yeah.
You know, I've got light when I want to work. I just have a different bulb.
Yeah.
You know, and so much of what we need to do is relatively simple and just takes a little bit of thought.
Well, interesting. My colleague who I work with just bought an electric car. And it's a very nice car, and he's very happy about it. And he's one of the first people I know that has bought one. And I understand that there's a fleet of them that are coming. I see commercials on television, and I know that this time around, all the automakers are really serious about it. When GM came up with the first prototype, they were really kind of seeing whether the public liked it, and they did, but they didn't build them for the public after that. So now that it looks like Cadillac and all these brands are coming up with these electric cars. So I think you're right. We're going to start seeing changes develop, and they'll be good. People probably won't find it to be so difficult.
It's, you know, and it's interesting because we're in Midland County, and here in Midland County, there's actually a number of things going on that are pretty significant in terms of the environment. So very close by, we have Hemlock Semiconductor, which is one of the world's leading manufacturers of the polycrystalline silicon that goes into solar panels, as well as all of our devices.
And there's a lot of people working there.
And there's a lot of people working there.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest employers.
Making good money.
And that's green technology
in action.
In action.
That's right. And we have a brand new wind farm in the, that straddles Midland and Saginaw County now, that will be coming online probably in the next, certainly the next 6 months. I had a little bit of input in helping to kind of shepherd that through.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we're going to start seeing more solar in the Saginaw Valley, because we've got a number of coal plants that are going to be shutting down in this area, and that leaves behind all these marvelous transmission lines that utilities and solar developers and wind developers want to hook into.
Yeah.
So we've got all this great opportunity for green energy here, and I was in a group of farmers just last week from over here in Bay County who were full of enthusiasm for putting solar panels on parts of their fields.
There's a farm field out in Saginaw Township where the farmer has put that in, and where there was corn growing a couple of years ago, it's all covered in solar panels.
Yeah. Right.
And so, well, let me kind of lead to maybe the last part of something to consider, and that is considering climate change is an existential threat worldwide. Where are we with that? I know you've been to parts like Greenland and so forth. What do we know?
Well, as I said, 10, 15 years ago, I spent most of my time pushing back against people who say, no, climate change is not happening, it's all a hoax. I don't do that very much anymore, but I do spend a fair amount of time kind of like tamping down sort of like overly catastrophic doomism kind of thing. Not because I don't think we're in trouble. I think we're in trouble. This is the greatest challenge that civilization has ever faced.
Well, you had brought up the New York City subway system flooding recently.
Sure.
With a storm as a pretty good example of it's a big deal.
It's a huge deal, and we're seeing our infrastructure begin to fray and break down at the edges, and we're going to see that more and more frequently. But people have to not allow themselves to be paralyzed, because they need to understand that we have the solutions. What we have lacked so far is the political will to implement those solutions.
And why do you think the political will is lacking? Is it the fossil fuel industry? Is it?
Yeah, the richest, most powerful organizations that have ever existed in human experience are the fossil fuel industry, and they have put massive resources into creating this environment of misinformation and confusion and people's lack of trust in institutions that they should be listening to. And look where it's led us. People don't even believe that there's a virus and a pandemic out there that we have a vaccine for that works, and they're unwilling to even, put a piece of cloth over their face to protect their neighbors because this misinformation and confusion campaign about science has been all too effective. And so yeah, that's why our political will has been kind of sapped, because we haven't been able to get consensus around this. But I think that consensus is here now, But like I said, we need to talk about it.
Well, I think you're right. There's a disconnect between the people who represent us, who spend a lot of time talking to lobbyists and collecting checks from them for their campaigns, and the public at large. You had mentioned that about 70 to 80% of the population is in favor of moving ahead and dealing with climate change as adults would and trying to find solutions. Yet we seem to find a disconnect between that large group and the political people who write policy and legislation. And yet, even as you and I talk about it, they can ignore us because they have a way of getting elected without necessarily making those changes.
Right. Well, we're doing something about gerrymandering here in Michigan.
That's true.
So there's hope there. But I'll say this. I've spent a lot of time in rural, very conservative parts of the state over the last 4 or 5 years communicating about clean energy.
Yeah.
And what I am finding is that there's a lot of agreement that clean energy is where we need to go. even people who don't agree with me, they don't buy into the climate thing. They're not into the climate thing. But tell them that they can put a wind turbine in their farm that's going to generate income for them and tax base for their community. Now you got a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, if the economics shift to rural America and lift some of these communities out of poverty or a dead end, I think you're right. It's going to make a big difference. And really, with much of this energy that we're creating, the open spaces are really a good place to go.
Oh yeah, and so this is what leaves me kind of inspired, is that this conversation about clean energy is the most cordial, the most respectful, and the most productive dialogue between left and right that is happening anywhere in this country right now. And it is inspiring to be a part of it.
Well, you know, I want to add something here just because I think it's important. We're in the Great Lakes, and quadrillion gallons of water flow through the Great Lakes out to the St. Lawrence Seaway every year. But we have not harnessed that for hydroelectric energy or those kinds of things because we haven't had the imagination. We haven't had the creativity. We don't have the Jacques Cousteau thinking about creating huge turbines to create electricity, you know. And I think this is a time to think big, you know. When the infrastructure was built in the 1930s, they were thinking big.
Yep.
Built dams, TVA projects, all these kinds of things, hydroelectric power. You know, we sit in the Great Lakes on the potential for hydrology to actually be a source for an enormous amount of energy if we decided that we were going to do that. If we had a moonshot that incorporated the water of the Great Lakes, we could probably light up most of the eastern coast, plus the Midwest.
Well, we're coming along. Wind has been doing quite well, especially in here in central Michigan.
It's getting cheaper too.
First of all, yes. First and foremost, wind and solar are now the cheapest means of producing new electricity. Don't let anybody lie to you about that.
Yeah, I wanted you to say that.
Yeah, everybody, you know, all the investment community is just completely aligned on this, and that's why huge investment is going into these
One last thing is, as we see these global changes, you know, there's currently a war in Europe.
Yes.
And petroleum products are being strangled in the process.
Used as a weapon.
Used as a weapon. If we were self-sufficient, if we had our own energy sources here and didn't rely on oil coming in from Russia or Venezuela or the Saudis or whatever, we would be a much more secure nation.
Yeah, and don't let anybody tell you that we can drill our way out of this, because if you were under the assumption that that oil that's underneath our land is ours, that ain't ours. That belongs to Exxon as soon as it comes out of the ground, and it goes into a global market, and it is priced at a global market, and there is no way to drill ourselves away from being affected by events that are happening half a world away. So the only way to do that is to tap the energy that is flowing, literally falling on us in infinite supply every day. That's how we get out of this.
Okay, that's a good way to end this. Well, thank you for tuning in. Environmental activism is something that any person can decide to do in their community, and as Pete had mentioned, talking with your neighbors, and it might strike up some interesting conversations. Maybe your parents or maybe somebody isn't going to agree with you politically, but I think what you brought up is that bringing this up is really important. We need to start looking at this as a real issue and do it in the way you suggested, with being respectful and trying to get a dialogue going.
You bet. That is the way.
Well, Pete, thank you for joining in on this. And if people want to get a hold of you, is there a link or something they can contact you at?
Well, I have a website. It is at climatecrocs.com, where I I bust the cracks of climate disinformation.
Okay.
climatecracks.com. That's one way, and I think there's a contact link there.
Okay, good. Good to know. Well, thank you for tuning in to A to Zig. This has been about environmental activism. And if you're an environmental activist, let us hear from you. You know, get involved. Contact the links on MCTV or make a comment on YouTube. We'd like to hear what you have to say. We look forward to all the activists becoming more active in the future because we're all in this together. Thank you so much.